who will be presenting the first presentation to you, which will be a Q&A. Veerle will be interviewing and Rhian will be answering. And I'm not going to tell anything more because you guys are going to introduce the topic wonderfully yourselves. Back here in the corner, sort of hidden away, we have a sketchnoter, and she's going to summarize the speeches for us. So don't pay attention to her while she's drawing, we'll show those at the end. So thank you so much, and take it away.
All right, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks Rhian especially for being here. We're very delighted to have you. As always, we have to start with a few introductory statements. So behind me, you can see we've got an interactive presentation tonight, which means that later on you will be able to send in questions as we're talking here. If you want to do that, follow the instructions up there. So whip out your phone, go to worldwideweb.menti.com, and you insert that code over there, and it takes you to this presentation, and you can interact, and it will be super exciting. All right? So everybody take a minute, everybody who wants to. Is it taking too long?
No, I'm in.
Yeah? Good? Well done. Right, I see other people who are in.
Yes.
Great, okay, well, I'm sure that will work out. Right, so as I said, Rhian, thanks very much for being here. I want to do a small introduction of everybody who's involved in tonight. So first of all, right, we've got Lisk Center, very important. Has anybody here been here before? Almost everybody. Okay, well, that's absolutely wonderful. Then zone out for this next couple of minutes. Right, it's a non-profit organization. Did you know? Encouraging blockchain awareness. I'll keep this short, actually. I was going to say, check the schedule because there's lots of fascinating events on all the time. So be sure to check it out. They're on Meetup, join the group. You can do this pretty much every night of the week. If anybody needs Wi-Fi, there we go. Does anybody need Wi-Fi? Because then I'll leave the slide on for you. Good to go. All right. Next important thing, the blockchain testing community. Woohoo! Woohoo! Yeah, shout out. So that's us. We're a working group founded by Son of Issa, who's right there. Originally, this was a testing-centered working group. Wanted to explore the topic of blockchain, specifically related to testing. But at this point, pretty much got 63 members, I think, as of yesterday, but we didn't update the slide, sorry about that. We've got 63 members, about 20 of those are quite active. What else? Right, everybody who wants to join is welcome, because we're always looking, everybody is welcome. Even the stragglers. So yeah, we're all, well, not always looking for new members, but anybody who wants to join is very, very welcome. And all levels of expertise are welcome, and I would like to stress that as well. If you're an absolute beginner, we've got material for you to bring you up to speed in about a week. So our goals are, as it says there, improving blockchain quality and developing best practices for blockchain testing. So we're working on it quite hard. If you want to know more about it, join. Put it that way. A couple of words about me. I'm a tester. I work for Riskit. I'm one of those more or less 20 active members of the blockchain testing community. I used to be an absolute beginner. So when I joined the group, that was because I wanted to know more about the topic. And at this point, I'm an aspiring expert, but by no means an expert. And so, of course, the most exciting point is Rhian Lewis. I prepared a slide for you, but maybe you want to introduce yourself? Would that be?
Yes, cool.
Yes.
So I'm a developer, tester, crypto enthusiast since 2013. I am one of the developers of one of the first cryptocurrency portfolio trackers, capmycrypto.com. I'm a back-end developer for that. And I do lots of talking and writing about blockchain type stuff. I'm pretty obsessed with it. I'm also the instructor for the B9 Ethereum Quality Assurance Engineer course. And I travel around and talk about cryptocurrency and blockchain a lot more than is probably healthy for one individual.
Right. Any questions? Right, great. So as I said before, now that we're all up to speed, welcome, welcome. Right. I'll give the
Full house.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited. Great. So now that we're all up to speed about who we are, who is here, I would like to give the interactive aspect of tonight a quick try. For everybody who's in new and who missed the first slide, if you whip out your phone and you go to www.menti.com, so that's M-E-N-T-I, Menti, like Mentos, but with an I, and you fill it, oh, I have to look up the code. Oh, there we go, there it was. Right, you insert that code, you can partake interactively in tonight's presentation. Right, so let's give that a shot. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Ooh. Right, also speaking you. How much do you know about blockchain? Seeing that almost everybody here said that they had been to Lisk Center before, I'm pretty sure that everybody is going to say tons. But let's see what happens. Oh, there we go. Oh, look, we've got one.
Whoa!
That's fantastic.
This is properly interactive.
Yeah, it's very
awesome.
interactive. All right, well. Fantastic. All right, well, as I said before, we welcome all levels of expertise, so this is actually very exciting. Oh, a little group is gaining. Amazing. Right, the good news is also that nobody here says they know absolutely nothing about blockchain, so that's quite comforting. Right, let's try another one. The first word that pops into your head when you hear blockchain. Go. See what we get. Yeah. Right, Rhian, any comments on what we've got so far?
I quite like the very central placement of Bitcoin.
That was inevitable, really. All right, wow.
I hope the person that wrote Craig isn't a Bitcoin Cash aficionado. Maybe it's somebody called Craig. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
All right, that's
very cool.
That's it. All right, great. Thanks very much for that. Seeing that we're in quite a small group, it's absolutely fine if anybody wants to ask a question out loud. We kind of planned this thinking that there was going to be 120 people here, and it would be very chaotic indeed if everybody was shouting out questions all the time. Seeing that we're with 40 people or so, if there is a natural lull in the conversation and you want to ask something or anything, please do. Otherwise, if you feel awkward doing that, you can send it in using the same tool, or what is it that you just used? Yes?
Or may I ask a question for Rhian?
Yes.
And, so what's your motivation to be working and being actively involved in the blockchain space? Like, what do you see yourself contributing to?
My first involvement, actually, before I start, I forgot to say my thank yous, so I just want to say Goede Avond and hartelijk bedankt to, firstly to Zonna for inviting me, Farouk for organising, and Vila and everyone else for being so welcoming. So your question is a really good one. I read about Bitcoin in the very early days, and I just became convinced that peer-to-peer interactions that enable people to cut out a lot of the overarching centralised organisations in the world is fundamentally a good thing. I was also very interested in trading, so there was a partly selfish interest as well. But then the more I learnt about these systems, first of all Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and then other non-payment uses for blockchain technology, I just thought it was really important that as many people as possible understood, if not the details of the technology, then the social possibilities, the organisational possibilities, and were able to use this themselves to interact. And for these reasons, which we'll go into later on with Viola's questions, I think it's really important to retain the ability for people to interact directly peer-to-peer rather than necessarily through blockchains hosted and coordinated and managed by large organisations. I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of worthwhile stuff in distributed ledger technology being used by large corporates because it can make things more transparent, it can help with the trust issues, but fundamentally my interest in this technology has always been first of all in the field of peer-to-peer payments, and then just this idea that people have this completely trustless layer of networks over which they can conduct any kind of transactions. I think it's really important and it's really interesting, and when you discover something that you think's really interesting, say you're really into Game of Thrones or something like that, and you go round telling people Game of Thrones is really awesome, you should start watching it. It's the same thing with blockchain technology, and it's really fascinating for me. I run a community that I and a friend started in London called London Women in Bitcoin. And it's really fascinating seeing people come in who know nothing about the technology, a bit skeptical, and then it's like a light bulb going on. And it's a really gratifying experience.
All right, great. Cool. This is the question slide, so if anybody sends in a question, then it will appear on the screen. I'll just start with a question of my own, right? Could you, let's say for that group of 8 people that know a little about blockchain, could you introduce the subject of interoperability? Can you tell us what it is and then why we need it?
Okay, so that's a really good question because some people might say that we don't need it. I think it's really important because if you think of the analogy of going way back to the last century, people who've been around for as long as I have will remember that there used to be VHS and Betamax, 2 completely incompatible tape formats, which meant that a lot of energy and effort got wasted in duplicating things and people investing in home hardware that they couldn't use with other formats. And for that reason, that meant that one of these technologies, and a lot of people think that Betamax was actually a lot technically better than VHS, that meant that one technology failed and another one prevailed. The opposite happened when the internet came along because TCP/IP meant that you had this interoperability between different machines and different devices. You could actually transmit data, and then things like HTML meant that you had a standard emerging where people could communicate and send data that would be understood by different machines. So while a lot of the different blockchains and distributed ledger platforms that we have now do a particular thing well, we're seeing a lot of development in silos because you can't necessarily you can't at all natively access data on one blockchain from another blockchain. So also there's a lot of confusion about this idea of interoperability and what it means. When some people talk about it, they interpret that as meaning smart contracts that will execute on one blockchain and be understood on another blockchain. That's actually a pretty extreme edge case of the kind of thing that's useful, because interoperability takes many forms. I was talking to someone about this a couple of weeks ago, and at its most basic level, it might not even mean interoperability between blockchains. It might mean interoperability between a legacy system and a blockchain, or it might mean interoperability just in terms of taxonomy. Do we have a common language that different blockchain platforms are using? We have a lot of confusion, for example, over what a smart contract is. And now we've even got Vitalik Buterin saying he wishes he'd never coined the term because it's led to so much confusion. So, and a lot of people are steering away from that. We have a lot of questions over what immutability means on one blockchain compared to another blockchain. So while there are working groups emerging for taxonomies, we can even look at the way we name things as being a relevant factor in interoperability. Then when you start talking about interoperability in the sense that most people understand it, i.e. being able to communicate between blockchains, even that works on different levels. At its most simple level, it could be something like an open protocol like atomic swaps, which mean, or token bridges, which mean that you can exchange assets between platforms. Or it might mean something entirely more complicated, like what Polkadot are doing or trying to do, where you have actual smart contracts being read and understood by different chains. It could just mean using an API so that you can so that you can do things like generating random numbers from block numbers on the Bitcoin blockchain or on the Ethereum blockchain. Interoperability is one of those things, like the word blockchain itself, that just covers this kind of really wide and quite dizzying array of different things that people mean by interoperability. So it's kind of not an easy question to answer. Why is it worth talking about? Why is it important? So rather that the examples I've cited have all been quite abstract. So the kind of real life example that you might use for this, why might it be useful? Why is it important? What is it? A good illustration would be, I'd hazard a guess that most people in this room are gamers of some variety or other, or have at least played games at some point. So yeah, so hey, the classic example of why of stuff you can do with interoperability is things like having an in-game object that can be transferred between games and between platforms completely independently of a game. So say you are playing a game on one platform and you've got something like a sword or a weapon that's been used in this absolutely awesome battle that's being streamed on Twitch TV, and that sword has its own value as a unique digital asset. You might want to trade that, and not trade that in the sense of selling it for Linden dollars in Second Life to someone else in Second Life, or selling a block of land in Decentraland to someone else in Decentraland. If somebody builds you a house in Decentraland,
there's already a ton of questions, so
right.
We can be here all night.
Okay. If somebody builds you a nice house to put on your block of land in Decentraland, you might want to monetize that or be able to trade it with somebody outside Decentraland. So, and Sana and I touched on this when we were having an unrelated conversation early this afternoon about how the generation that are now children perceive digital assets as being not necessarily different from physical assets. They're just another kind of class of asset in daily lives. So this idea of having these things that have an independent value that can be traded, suddenly interoperability between platforms becomes super important, because you're not talking about just transferring a record from one SQL database to another. You're talking about having something that is registered publicly and immutably and can be transferred to something else immutably. So I've just rambled on for ages.
No, that's absolutely fine. Please do. That's why we asked you to come. I think we can have a look at the questions that are being asked. on the screen. Let's see if this is something that you would like to talk about.
I'll talk about anything, whether or not I'm correct. Whether or not it's the right answer is another question.
No, because of course we've got our questions, but I think that if people take the trouble of coming here, then...
So this is a really difficult question to answer, because when we talk about blockchains, as I said, we're talking about very many different things. We're talking about, like, people will use the term blockchain to talk about something like IOTA, for example, which isn't actually a blockchain. They'll use blockchain to talk about something that is a private distributed ledger running on 5 nodes in a bank. They'll use blockchain, obviously, to talk about something like the Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum. Very difficult to have a common standard for these, but as I said before, a common taxonomy, a common protocol for naming things is super important. I think it would be more sensible to think about it in terms of having sets of different standards for different use cases. For example, if you're talking about financial products like derivatives or different asset classes that are traded or exchanged or settled by financial institutions, obviously makes a lot of sense to have a standard for that, so that you can have some kind of interoperability between Corda and the digital asset platform or something like that. Similarly, for things like IOTA and Hashgraph, which are very focused on IoT use cases of having multiple not very secure transactions that are operated very rapidly and very scalably, but not necessarily with the same level of security. You might want a different standard for those. So I think it's important to have standards that are common across platforms but within different sectors. But the idea of having a common taxonomy is really, really important.
All right. When we were preparing this, I was imagining the setup where you have your computer close by and you can actually operate it, and now I have a clicker. Which means that I'll have to get up and move and see if we've got any.
I can shout out the questions to you.
Oh, that would be perfect.
The next one after this one is, which blockchain will win?
Okay, so I think with this many use cases, I'm not quite a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm sort of slightly in that direction more than the other direction. I think we will see multiple iterations of things, because different technologies are really good for certain things and others are not good. In terms of public blockchain platforms, I think one of the fascinating themes over the... I need eyes in the back of my head to see what's going on behind me. One of the overriding themes over the last couple of years, which I think has been super interesting, is 2 or 3 years ago, we used to have a lot of the banks talking about blockchain, not Bitcoin, blockchain, not Bitcoin, so on. That we've seen a complete reversal of that, and the emergence of second layer solutions for Bitcoin has produced this really interesting scenario where people are using things like Lightning, using things like side chains, and all these different second layer technologies that are emerging, so that the Bitcoin blockchain is used as the ultimate kind of settlement layer, but a lot of stuff is kept off it. In terms of public blockchains, we see that nothing comes close to the security of Bitcoin. But then the emergence of different distributed ledger technologies that are supported and being used by the big banks, the big accountancy firms and so on, we're definitely going to see winners and losers among those. So things like Hyperledger, Corda, probably the two front runners in terms of that. And I don't think necessarily talking about losers and winners there is a really helpful thing, because you kind of use them for different things. For example, Corda is so focused on financial settlements that it has its own set of use cases. So you could say that will succeed in one particular area where people are looking for permission distributed ledgers, but it wouldn't be appropriate for other things. So it's horses for courses, as we say.
All right. In the meantime, we've had some help with the technology. So we've got another question up on the screen. which markets adopt blockchain at the moment?
Okay, now this is a super interesting question, and rather than I'll run through a few sectors. I think probably we're talking about which sectors rather than which markets. So if anyone is interested in looking at the very latest current active projects, did anyone or who in this room saw a really interesting piece by Forbes, I think it was last month or the month before, where they had a list of 50 projects which are currently live or in advanced POC stage and close to live. And that was pretty interesting because you were talking about nearly everyone on that list of 50 companies was a very well-known blue chip company, recognizable by anyone. So the sectors probably that are gaining most traction and who are already operating projects that are live at the moment, probably financial services, supply chain and shipping. This project which IBM and Maersk operate, TradeLens, is in terms of being an active consortium and being used and having people signing up to it. And you can see why shipping is such a popular use case. You know, this much quoted statistic of the average container ship that comes over from China to Europe generating more than 2 kilograms of paperwork and tying up thousands of people in customs offices and tax offices and bills of, writing out bills of lading and things like that. So shipping is a huge area. Supply chain generally, and big supermarkets like in the UK, Sainsbury's, are pretty advanced. I was at Blockchain Expo 2 weeks ago, and one of the supply chain panels had the CTO from Sainsbury's there. And he was talking about their supply chain management blockchain project, which was super interesting because I had no idea it was that far advanced. And of course, we have huge progress in financial services. We've got big banking consortiums. We've had, and not just in like capital markets and digital asset settlement and things like that, retail banking as well. Italy's biggest retail banks did a project a few months ago where for a month all their retail banking transactions between 8 banks actually went onto a blockchain platform supplied by Axoni at the same time as they ran it in parallel traditionally. And that was apparently a huge success. So while there are people experimenting with blockchain technology in every sector you can imagine, from mobility to healthcare to publishing to you name it, I'd probably pick out financial services, supply chain and shipping, which kind of overlap a little bit the other two, as being the primary cases where there are good live examples of people using the technology.
All right. We're getting tons of questions, and I'm sure they're all a lot more interesting than one I came up with. So let's have a look at this. Isn't it a bit early to think about interoperability when so many projects come and go and the DLT space keeps evolving rapidly?
Yes, this is a really good question. Actually, I'd prepared answers to all the questions that you sent me the answers to.
Sorry about this.
I'm doing this completely on the fly. Yes, it's way too early. So that is a really good question because if you think about the whole topic of interoperability as putting in the groundwork for things that will be needed in maybe 5 years' time. I was going to say 5 to 10 years' time, but things in terms of blockchain technology, as we know, tend to move really, really, really quickly. So probably more like 5 years' time. I think in terms of permissioned blockchains, it's probably not too early. In terms of public blockchains, yes, it's way too early to be thinking about this when people haven't solved a lot of the more fundamental problems around scalability and so on. Interoperability is kind of like a nice to have rather than something that's really useful at the moment when people are struggling to get a lot of public blockchains to work usefully for lots of things. But we're seeing some really interesting interoperability projects, like I noticed that Accenture announced an interoperability thing that they'd done, being able to transfer assets fully between Corda and the digital asset platform, for example. So they, Accenture don't just do things for fun or because it's cool. They're doing this because they see a genuine commercial need for this. If you think about, you know, atomic swaps and things like that, are people using them? Is it too early? Well, okay, so things like DEXs, decentralized exchanges, use atomic swaps. That's kind of like a bit of a small market at the moment. Probably will be more interesting over time. But in terms of talking about interoperability, i.e. smart contract execution between different platforms, yes, it's a luxury at the moment, given that we haven't got public blockchains by and large to scale properly yet. So it's kind of early to be thinking about it as something that people have to have, but not too early to kind of do blue sky thinking about how it might work in the future, and certainly not too early for you know, permissioned ledgers to be able to need to swap things between themselves. And going back to the point I made initially about the different types of interoperability, we need to think about interoperability of blockchain technology and legacy systems, or else there's not a business model, because people need to be able to integrate this stuff with a lot of the technologies that they already have without rebuilding their whole stack. So that type of interoperability is kind of important now.
All right. They just keep coming. What's your opinion on centralized bodies such as banks and governments embracing the keep your friends close but your enemies closer?
Okay, now this is something I feel really strongly about.
Great.
So I write a lot about, and this isn't like an advert because obviously it's free, my Medium is not monetized, but I write a lot on Medium about blockchain technology, and I was kind of moved in kind of anger and provocation a few years ago to write about this when the Bank of England was doing a experiment. It was doing a proof of concept with a university in the UK about how a government cryptocurrency might work. As far as, I'll deal with this in two parts. As far as the banks themselves using blockchain technology to interact with each other more efficiently, that really doesn't bother me either way. So the slightly annoying thing is that they talk about blockchains when they are not really blockchains. I see the person who asked, who's the person who asked that question? Correct use of DLT instead of blockchain. So if the banks can communicate with each other in an efficient manner, and also it helps the audit process, helps transparency, that's neither a good nor a bad thing. People can retain the opportunity, ability to use peer-to-peer payment systems without going through banks if they want to do that. If the banks want to benefit their shareholders by being able to operate with each other in a low-cost environment and take advantage of the technology, then that's great for them, that's great for their shareholders. And also the technology is really interesting, so it provides a lot of developers and business analysts with really interesting work, so it's not fundamentally a bad thing.
Data structure.
Exactly.
Right.
It's just another data structure, and it's really interesting. I wouldn't rule out working on one of those projects in future because I am very interested in the way it operates. So I have no ethical problem with that, because I sense this question kind of is about ethics at the end of the day. Government use of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, I think, is really worrisome. And for lots and lots of reasons. This thing about, I mean, we've already seen experiments, obviously, in Venezuela with the petro, and lots of countries are getting to the point where they're experimenting with blockchain-based digital money. The case study that I looked at for the Bank of England was nothing more than 5 nodes within the Bank of England, 5 minting nodes, I think, and then one kind of validator master node that validated the minting nodes. It was nothing more than a centralized system. But where it gets really scary and dystopian is this idea of governments being able to use programmable money. We're moving to a cashless economy very rapidly, obviously. I think Sweden's probably the most cashless. Countries like the Netherlands and the UK are not far behind because it's convenient. Going cashless and only being allowed to use government issued money is problematic on all kinds of levels, because while it's instinctively obvious to say it's a really good thing because this means people won't be able to evade taxes, people won't be able to conduct organised crime activities so easily. It gets really shady because you start looking at an example like Japan, where obviously they've had massive deflation over the past few decades. They've tried to alleviate that with massive tax cuts by money printing, and using kind of macroeconomic big sticks to beat people into behaving in the way they want them to behave, which is spending money. But because of Japanese demographics and cultural reasons, Japanese people tend to, this is a bit of a sweeping statement, but it's true. Japanese people are savers, not spenders, like the Anglophone countries tend to live on credit. And they've been unable to reinflate their economy. So they've even done things like giving people cash bonuses in the hope that they'd go out and buy new sofas or whatever. So, and they didn't, they just saved the money. So it just failed completely. But if you have programmable money, you can do things like if you want to help out the farming sector, you can give people tax rebates or give people cash bonuses that expire within 3 weeks if they don't go and spend it on cheese. Or you can make sure that people who are unemployed and receiving out-of-work benefits are only allowed to buy, I don't know, carrots and porridge oats, or something kind of like worthy and healthy. These things might sound like they're a good idea, but they're very, very terrifying social engineering, and I think we should be really worried about that. So from my point of view, I think it's a neutral to good thing that banks and financial institutions are embracing this very, very interesting technology. I think it's very scary when governments start to do the same thing. Personal opinion. Other people might think it's totally cool.
Right, we've got a question that wins on conciseness, so maybe we can get a really concise answer. I don't know. What are atomic swaps?
Well, I'm not going to explain how they work, because there'd be lots of charts and waving my arms about and I'd probably still get it wrong. But essentially, an atomic swap is when you are able to directly exchange a token or a coin on one network for a token or coin on another network, without going through an intermediary, and it's a direct transfer of value. Now, these already exist. It's an open protocol. As I said before, a lot of the decentralized exchanges use these, but they are fraught with problems. So at its most simple level, you can imagine somebody who wants to swap X amount of ether for the same value in, I don't know, some really low cap cryptocurrency that, we'll use an extreme example, Mooncoin, which Mooncoin has like about 2 people mining it. So it would be extremely vulnerable to a 51% attack. And the fact that you might be able to swap 1 ether for 50 billion moon coin in an atomic swap does not really provide you fundamentally good value, because you would not necessarily be able to swap it back and get the same amount of ether because somebody could steal it. So atomic swaps are slightly fraught with problems in that you can, so basically the way they work, it's something a little bit like when you have a sidechain or a trust channel, when you lock up a certain amount of tokens on one chain so that they can't be touched while they're on another chain, and then if you swap them back, you unlock them. It's different from a burn.
So you said there won't be an intermediary involved, but how is the value of a coin determined then?
So the value of the coin is entirely determined between the two people conducting the exchange. So there isn't a market value. If you think about how the normal crypto exchanges work, it's like a very, very distilled version of that, because the prices on the exchanges, like say Binance or whatever, are not actually set by the exchanges. They're entirely an expression of market value, where people put in buy offers which are matched with sell offers by a matching algorithm. So an atomic swap is just people agreeing that they will exchange a certain number of tokens on one chain for a certain number on another chain and swap them back again. But unless you're swapping between chains of equivalent security, it becomes problematic. But reading about atomic swaps is really interesting. So I think it would be a really good idea to sort of, there's some brilliant videos on YouTube.
All right, we've got another one, very concise. What's
taxonomy? Taxonomy is just, all right, so maybe I'm guilty of using posh words when a simple one could do. It's the science of naming things. So when you talk about taxonomy in the plant or animal world, it's just about saying this animal belongs to this large family of animals and it's a species this of this species. And with the effect that you have quite precise words to describe a particular thing, so that if you talk about a particular type of spider in somewhere where they have spiders, Australia, Australia, they have spiders in Australia, and the same spider at London Zoo, by quoting the spider's Latin name, or common name if it doesn't have a Latin name, you know exactly what spider you're referring to, whereas something that doesn't have a taxonomy, like snowflakes. Okay, so there are some people in the world who have, you know, this old thing about people having 21 different words for different types of snow. And in most countries, especially countries where it doesn't snow, you don't have that taxonomy. It's important to have a taxonomy. It just means a commonly understood naming system. But I didn't really have to say taxonomy. I could have just said names.
Either way, I think this is important to you because earlier you complimented Saskia on her correct use of...
What does that mean?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, correct taxonomy.
All right, perfect. I'm just going to keep going with the questions from the audience, if that is okay for you. 5
minutes though, so.
Oh, is it 5 minutes?
Oh my God.
All right. Oh dear. So, will the Bitcoin chain be the proof of immutability for all the others to connect to?
Okay, so this is an opinion, and it's a controversial opinion, and people, I don't know how many people here participate in crypto Twitter or crypto Reddit. If you don't, probably don't start, because it's a rabbit hole that you probably don't want to go down. But this is one of the really hotly disputed issues, and the Bitcoin maximalists versus everyone else. I tends to think that, like we said before, it's not going to be the only blockchain, the only data structure that works in this way, but it's getting to the point where I can see it performing this function at some point in the future, where people have different data structures that are linked in a blockchain type, cryptographically linked, immutable, back to the beginning of time kind of way, that link into the Bitcoin blockchain at certain points, and it becomes almost like a public utility. I think it's I think it's actually quite useful to think about blockchains like Bitcoin, almost like public utilities, like the pipes and cables that we run the internet on. It really is. Yeah, I mean, it's too much of an opinion for me to say yes, this will happen, but. I suppose a little bit of me, a little romantic bit of me would really like that to be the truth. Whether or not it will be the truth, I don't know.
All right, I want to close on one of the questions that we had prepared for you, because one of the things you yourself mentioned was that interoperability might be the perfect solution to all of our problems. It might not be. It might just be a stage in a longer process on our way to a better solution. What can you say about that?
Yes, because so I know it wasn't a yes or no answer. I was just saying yes.
That's fine. You can answer with anything you like.
I think the question would be: Is this particular this particular use case, some hypothetical use case, something that is best solved by interaction between different blockchains, or would it be better suited by an entirely new platform? So you've got something like Dfinity, for example, got things like Cosmos, Polkadot, which have their own whole ecosystems of people being able to have their own small blockchains interacting with each other, either via hubs or separate chains. Dfinity works slightly differently. So you might you might have a problem that is best solved not by interoperability, but by something entirely different. I think it's potentially a really important thing. But the interoperability between blockchain tech and the legacy systems is the most important thing now. I think the use cases for it will become clear, but certainly for some things it's really important, like, for example, this thing that I talked about with the successful experiment for asset swaps between Corda and R3. That's obviously something that's useful now, so it's being developed now.
All right. I think that wraps it up. Thanks very much, Rhian. Thanks everybody in the audience for sending in questions.
Thank you. They were awesome questions. Thank you.